Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. I am your host, Todd Embley, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Michel de Rijk. Michel is an esteemed APAC marketing executive who has held leadership roles and posts at some of the world's best agencies, including most recently CEO APAC for S4. Michel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Todd. Happy to be here.
All right, so where in the world are you today? We're recording you from.
I happen to be in Singapore at the moment, where I've been living for the last 14 years. Just come back from a nice sort of summer trip to Canada, which I think you are at the moment as well. So we have some shared passion there. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Not too far from where you tend to hang out in Vancouver. Where I want to know a little bit about how you ended up in APAC. So if you could walk us through a little bit of your background, whether it's your school, past posts, and how you ended up working in that area of the world.
So it's so I started in the let's call it marketing, advertising space, whatever you want to call it, probably about 20 odd years ago. Actually, my first job was in the working for the Dutch Yellow Pages. So really sort of old school sales, but then on the online department of that. So helping them to transition from the old paper to digital. Did that for a few years. There was sort of full on sales and first step into digital marketing. Moved into ad tech, advertising tech, sort of the ad serving space, rich media ad serving space. Launched the business in the Netherlands for that. The company called I Wonder at that time, American business. And interestingly enough, after I did that in the Netherlands and in Dubai and the Middle East, which I thought was a nice growth market, I was actually on my way on holiday to Bali. And I had a stopover in Singapore. And I remember this quite well. I was probably for about 3 days in Singapore. And so this must have been around 2008, 2009. When sort of in the West, if you want to call it, economical crisis was still going around pretty rapidly. There was lots of negativity in general in the news, on the streets, and everything. And then I was in Singapore, and I remember well that I was walking through the central business district, and people were breaking for lunch, and I felt this energy, an energy of growth still. And at that time, I realized how amazing it is to spend time and live in areas and countries where the economy grows. And it sounds like a very sort of simplistic thing, but you've spent some years in China as well, where I think through those sort of economical growth years, that's a very different vibe. There's a very different energy. Knowing that the person who's selling you a bottle of water today is selling 2 bottles of water tomorrow. It's energetic, it's exciting. So while I was enjoying my holiday in Bali, I was thinking, how can I move the business that I was working for at that time into the APAC region? Because I really wanted to move to Singapore. Discussed that with the board at that time, and everybody agreed that was a good plan. And that was my entry point to Singapore, to be honest, and the rest of the region.
That's cool. So you kind of dictated and wrote your own path to get there. And I completely agree with that energy. I like the way you put it. I've never in 4 years had anybody put it that way, where being in a place where you can feel the growth, you can feel that excitement, where everybody's running forward and looking forward, and nobody's bothering to look back or being too worried about what's behind them. Everybody's just looking forward. I definitely... that resonates with me for sure during that time when I was in China, the kind of the 2008 to 2016 years. Definitely hear that.
Yeah, I think China, especially sort of the post-Olympic, around the Olympics era, is what a lot of people talk about when sort of that big growth was happening. I remember when I arrived in Singapore that at that time the sort of still the founder of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, almost apologized to the people that for the first time since the existence of Singapore, they did not have double-digit GDP growth. At that time, Europe was flat, if at all. Right? Yeah. That's the different sort of environment you're in. So very exciting times.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of exciting, maybe for you, but not as much for me, you've been training for a marathon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's. I mean, after I decided to leave S4 Capital and a few months ago, I decided to focus more on myself and family, and a couple of passion projects, and yeah, a couple of stupid things along the way. And I sort of categorized this one in the stupid things. I think fitness and health has always been important for me, and to sort of balance, I think, the stressful work environment that we often have and the travel that comes with it. So for me to be able to get out of bed every day and get the trainings going on, whatever it is, I always set what I would call like a stupid goal, something that scares me, something that if I don't train for it, I'm afraid it will kill me, relatively killing. And I did earlier this year with a couple of friends. I did a ski mountaineering trip, sort of an odd route, as they call it in Europe. And I know from that like if I wasn't training for it, it would be a very tough week. So now my next project is indeed the Marathon of Chicago in sort of early October. So I'm trying to sort of get fit for that, the running fit, and yeah, it's one of those things that sometimes you just stretch yourself a little bit and get into the uncomfortable zone, to be honest. So partly looking forward to it, partly pretty scared as well.
Yeah. For those of you listening to us audio only, you should go to the video. Michel's pretty fit, dude. And you're Dutch, right?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
So how tall are you?
I'm a short Dutch, as I would call it. So I'm 181, so 6 foot, and that then I might have stretched it slightly, so probably slightly close to 5'9", but I call myself
right.
6 foot. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're pretty well built. You got some big arms. And being a big person going for a marathon, does that change your training? Does that
I actually, I probably spent the last 7 months doing a lot of sort of weight training. So I did all the wrong things to actually run a marathon. And that was sort of before I decided to go on full on into my marathon. I actually got married about 4 or 5 weeks ago in Canada, so I wanted to get fit for that. So that was my primary goal. And after that, I realized, oh shit, I'm 12 weeks out for my marathon, so I need to start focusing on some cardio training. So I dropped the gym sessions and moved it into more running, which obviously in Canada was a great place to start. The temperatures are good and the nature is great. Now being back in Singapore, waking up with 30 degrees centigrade isn't the best start of the day. But hopefully the Chicago Marathon, with a bit of luck, it's a lot cooler. So I'm betting a little bit on that as well.
Yeah. So for those of you at home who haven't been to Singapore, you can imagine a 6 foot, pretty buff dude, and he's training for a marathon. It's probably a low of 28 degrees Celsius at night with about 100% humidity. So that's, exactly. That's what we're looking at over there. Speaking of fitness, though, you tend to believe pretty strongly in China's economic fitness. From probably fair to characterize your stance that you're pretty bullish on China. So in your view, why is the China market so important and lucrative for brands?
Yeah, I think it's two ways. Like me being in the last, let's say 14, 15 years in the region here, I probably spent, and mainly working for Western companies, like US-based, European-based companies. In all honesty, like a big portion of my time has always been spent on educating and defending often this region. Right? I think there's a lot of misconceptions 14 years ago, and I think there are still misconceptions today. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing, especially during COVID, which I still believe that has hit this region significantly harder than any of the other regions. We went into COVID first, we came out of it last. We had some severe lockdowns from India, China to even sort of Australia and everything in between. And I think a lot of people outside of this region still don't really sort of understand how much that impacted people in general, the communities, but obviously also business. Everybody in this region needs to be very agile and very truly understanding like what has been happening and how we're sort of getting out of that. Then when it comes to China specific, like the reality is There's about 1.4 billion people there. So you can't ignore scale. That's about 20% of the global population, give or take. So for any brand want to do anything in China, you can't ignore it, right? And it's also the other way around. Like if an international travel out of China is still, it's catching up a little bit slower than expected. Domestic seems to be on track, but international, not really. Like, I'm not sure if you've been to, let's take the European, the southern part of Europe in this summer, and everybody was complaining it was already so busy. That is without the 500-600 million Chinese that are about to travel, right? So that's also the impact. And that's also how brands have to look at it, sort of the outbound travel. And I know from some smart brands that are doing it. So I think two ways. There is, for international brands, significant opportunity because of the scale in China. If there's a country that can bounce back out of setbacks, then it's a country like China. And without going into any sort of political discussions, but the fact that there is persistency in political leadership, you like it or not, obviously gives them the opportunity to have a longer term view on things. Which I think is often the weakness of countries where there's significant changes every 4 years or every 8 years. So I think that obviously gives opportunities to be bullish. And I think there's a lot of interesting innovation coming out of China that slowly is moving into the rest of the world. And I think in the past, a lot of people ask me about comparison, for example, between China and India. And I've always thought about, India, a lot of innovation in India is happening for outside of India. So they innovate a lot for the US specifically. And always seen that a lot of innovation in China was happening in China itself. So there's a lot more of a domestic approach. I see a shift on both sides, to be honest. But the opportunity, staying to talk about China a little bit more in detail, the opportunity there is almost beyond anywhere else. And it's too large to ignore. And I think the smarter brands, let it be international or let it be domestic, understand that opportunity. Again, we're talking about 1.4 billion people and significantly still growing economies there. And maybe the GDP growth isn't as high as analysts expected earlier this year. But that doesn't mean that the growth isn't there and that it's, it might have a slower bounce back as a lot of people have expected. But a few percent GDP growth in China is a few percent global GDP growth because of that scale and that opportunity. And that's why I think everybody needs to have it on their radar.
Agreed. I think that it depends on how far you're looking and how big you want to dream as a brand. But if you're looking 5 to 10 years out and you want to be international, you have to have exposure to China. Even simply for the understanding and learning, that's just an area of the world that you want to understand and learn and get to know earlier than better. It's going to be uber important. And 20 years from now, this podcast might not even exist because everybody should already be there and everything should already be understood. But the reason the podcast exists is because people are still afraid.
Yeah, absolutely. But like any strategy towards China needs to be at least 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. Because and this is where I think a lot of brands have been going wrong, or they haven't picked the right partners to do it with, or they thought they could enter China with a 1 to 2 year strategy and a carbon copy of what they've done in other markets. And every single one of them have failed. And then they blame the market for it instead of their own ignorance. Right? And if you as a brand still don't understand that, then maybe you shouldn't go to China, in all honesty.
I agree. You mentioned that you, early in that commentary, that you do spend a lot of time kind of defending China. Can you speak to maybe what some of that negative commentary is, either the media or other, like what is being said out there that people are trying to be maybe negative or downplay the importance of China? And what do you have to say about that? What is typically your response?
I think there's always a few things. It's like, nobody just generally, like the people towards who I need to defend it, they don't trust numbers coming out of China, right? That's one, right? So that's a discussion. And, in all honesty, some of them I don't trust as well. But okay, take 20% off on either side, it's still a big number, right? Just because of the sheer scale of it. So, and I don't think that's, they do it any different than other countries or environments or whatever it is. So I think that's one of them. I think there's still discussions about political instability that obviously, raises some challenges. There is discussions around unfair trading between foreign companies and domestic companies. Like, and all of these, these arguments, they might be partly true or not. Again, the opportunity is still there, and there's tons of brands and who do understand and take that with that potential risk and tap into that opportunity. And I think that's where the excitement is. What also what people I've tried to need to understand is the innovation that comes out of the market, but also the innovation of brand positioning, the innovation of the way that how they approach business. In all honesty, right? I think the EV industry, for example, electric vehicles in China is massive and is super excited. And if everybody, in the Western world, and I'm sort of generalizing a little bit, talks about like the innovation that comes from Tesla. Like, if you look at the numbers and, just roughly speaking, there's probably going to be somewhere between 10 to 12 million EVs being sold in China alone. Tesla there's probably about under 1 million being sold in the US this year. Tesla produces just over 1 million cars a year. Like, they are not, internationally speaking, a big player. That's not where the innovation comes from, right? And when I was in China, I've been in China a few times this year. The energy, the innovation in that area, the partnerships between traditional automotive companies and tech companies that are launching these EV brands are amazing. Right, the Shanghai Auto Show, and we happened to walk there with a client, an international EV brand, and the CMO of that company walked around there and did not realize that there are 40 competitors there present. Like, and that's all like sort of Chinese innovation, and there is abilities and opportunities for Western brands to tap into that. I think VW just announced a partnership there as well with a local player, like, because they understand that they're eating the cheese of their bread if they don't watch out. So embrace it, work together, but at least learn and go into that market with almost sort of a clean sheet of paper on what your strategy is going to be there. Because if you go in there with, trying to roll it out in the way that you've done it before in other markets, it's going to cost you a lot of money and not a lot of success.
I know one of the biggest takeaways kind of in aggregate of my time in China was how much I grew as a person and how much I realized I had tunnel vision and groupthink from where I came from and the small little area of the world that I existed in before that. And it shattered a ton of perceptions that I didn't even know I held until they were shattered. And it was an arduous process to kind of grow and go through that. But I can only imagine how important that could be for an actual company or a brand. You hit it on the head when you were talking about, listen, the innovation, the way they do marketing, the way they do sales, the way they do finance, and just the way they see and do business. It's so different. They're doing things over there that you wouldn't even know were possible or existed or even comprehend. So without exposure to that area of the world, you're not growing as a person. Like, you think you did your MBA. I challenge you to go do a APAC MBA for your company.
Yeah.
Now, I'll get off
Sorry,
that
sorry.
soapbox.
One
Go
sec.
ahead.
I think I have some background noise. Do you hear that?
It sounds okay to me.
Oh, okay. There's somebody vacuuming. Sorry.
Oh yeah, and a voice. Hey, it happens though. I'm the only
Okay.
one. As the host, I'm the only one that needs to sound good.
Okay.
The audience has a lot of patience and understands guests are kind of mailing,
I
phoning
can
it
switch
in.
it off if you want to. But if you don't hear it, it's okay.
No, it's fine. Plus, I'm going to clean it all up after anyway, so don't worry about it. You mentioned going to China and going to Shanghai and going to the auto show. So I'd like to zoom out a little bit and ask you a broader question. What were your takeaways from visiting China earlier in the year, and what was it as it was coming out? What did it look like and feel like as it was coming out of the pandemic?
I think my first trip to China after sort of the COVID, the second large COVID lockdown, as I would describe it in China, was I think right after Chinese New Year. So it must have been like end Feb or early March. I think a few takeaways there. One, it felt, and it sounds horrible for all the horrible months then obviously the local people had. But when I was there, it felt like nothing has happened in a way that people were back on the streets. There was energy again. There was, life was back. Sort of that bounce back. I think very different from what I've seen, for example, after COVID, going to the West Coast in the US, like San Fran and LA, etc., where everybody still, moved into the suburbs or other places, and CBDs just being dead, and anyway, all the other challenges that arise there at the moment. But it felt like that was all normal. That's one. What I especially noticed at that time was a very, very strong presence of domestic brands. Like they bounce back way faster, way more agile, way more trust and confidence that everything was going to be okay again. And they didn't know, obviously, exactly how that route was going to play out, but they jumped in and modified along the way. So it's almost like a first mover advantage they had there. I noticed that a lot of the international brands were still probably a little bit surprised by the all of a sudden quick opening, and did not really have a China strategy in place. While, around the same time, there was a lot of sort of financial earning reports coming out, obviously, of previous financial years. And a lot of them said that, because of China's slowdown in sort of 22, their results were impacted significantly. Right. So there's on one hand, they're talking about how big the impact was in 22, but I don't feel that everybody prepared enough for, okay, what if China opens? What is then our strategy? Let's have the playbook ready in case it happens, because it might come unexpected. In that period, actually in March, speaking to a couple of our international brands and clients there, a lot of them were actually saying that their international management team is in town that week or the week after. So there were sort of like the board meetings were moving into China to understand, what is going to be our strategy. So I think it was a positive direction. I think there were it's about a couple of months behind, and it gave a lot of the domestic brands massive opportunities to, and also like land grab skill, in all honesty, which is a hard fight to get back into. So I think, honestly, I think a lot of the potential brands and international brands have sort of missed a little bit of an opportunity there. I think so. I think that's one takeaway. One other takeaway is it's a bit of a weird one, but I didn't know that Tim Hortons was so sort of successful in China. I think they opened like 600 shops in stores in during
the
COVID.
Growth of coffee culture.
And it was one of the times that I was like, okay, is there still room for additional coffee shops? And when I found out that Starbucks is still opening up a coffee shop in China every like 4 hours or something for the last 15 years, I realized that there's still a lot of room for coffee shops and bagels. That was another takeaway. But I didn't expect Tim Hortons to jump into that. But exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's still fun to be excited and surprised by China. You were talking about that COVID thing, and I've never really dove into it with anybody here. And we talk about that strategy, and you mentioned, listen, you got to have a 5-year kind of strategy if you're going to go to China. But man, what if you were in the middle of that strategy when COVID hit? Like if you had executed your strategy and you were positioned, you probably fared that storm pretty well. If you were mid strategy, that might have hurt or potentially even killed your APAC strategy. And you might need a couple of years of going back home and regrouping before you go back. But then I also think that now might be one of the best times to capitalize and go back, because I think they've had 2 to 3 years of, like you said, a lot of homegrown.
And you're hitting the nail on the head, because to be honest, I think you're right. Like being mid strategy when COVID hits, and myself spending the last 5 years at a company that we grew from nothing to a sizable business, being hit by COVID midway, we got impacted by COVID massively on that strategy, and set us back significantly. But to your point, if you then want to bring that back to the levels of excitement and significant growth, is there a better place to do it than China?
Yeah.
Right. And this is a little bit like, I can understand it's not easy to convince a board somewhere on the other side of the world that, the 2-3 years of investment of strategy in China, they're not lost, but they're significantly behind, what was expected because of all the lockdowns. But yes, to really come to the full completion of the strategy that we set out a few years ago, we need to double down on it. That's not the easiest conversation, but it says something. If your board agrees with that and they are with you on it, that means that they do understand China and the opportunity and the importance of it. And I think that's where, not all companies have been able to execute on that. Anyway, this is one of the things that I've seen a lot during COVID anyway, is that, and it's understandable, but a lot of companies in times of insecurity pull back to the mothership, as I would call it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, especially countries or strategies that are halfway execution, those will be the ones that are being axed first. And that just sets back, I think, a lot of the progress that was progress potential, let it be in China, but especially the whole region as Asia.
Yeah. Well, we can quote Warren Buffett. Obviously, he's a massive investor in BYD, and he loves the EV, and he loves the market in China. But Warren Buffett, that's his investing strategy. When everybody's selling, I'm buying, and when everybody's buying, I'm selling.
It's a little bit easier when you got unlimited funds, right? But
yeah, when your name is Warren Buffett, you can say that
exactly.
kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay, well, speaking of that kind of stuff, many of our listeners are either owners of consumer brands or they work at consumer brands in some capacity. From your experience, then, what would be the basics, the pillars of a successful China entry strategy, in your opinion?
In all honesty,
just top of your head, you can in any order.
To be honest, I think it starts with really going in with, like what I said earlier, with a clean sheet of paper. Realize that the competitive field is very different. Target audience is different. The behavior of your target audience is extremely different. Pricing strategy needs to be adjusted or needs to be different. You can't, it needs to be adaptable, quick, and snappy. Environment changes extremely fast in China. I think those are and everybody says, I understand it. But then they still walk into the country with the playbook and say, okay, small example. Brand does an entry into China and wants to make sure that the global brand guidelines are being followed. Right? It's a small thing. Mm-hmm. If you go into China, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be protective of your brand guidelines, but you can't have every little asset that's being created need to be sent to the other side of the ocean for approval. You know what I mean? Be adaptable to the local market and let the local market, let it be with a partner or with a local team, let them own certain areas of it that can make them compete and operate in a competitive Chinese environment. And I've seen too much protectiveness from, let's go, so the mothership, the HQ, about what's happening in China. I'm not talking about big business practices, right? I mean, we all need to, that's fundamentals, and that needs to be followed at any given time. But I'm talking about speed to market, adaptability, positioning, pricing strategies. Like, you need to set it up as a separate stream of your normal operations, if that makes sense. Like, because if you don't do that, you're blindfolding your team into a sword fight, if you know what I mean. Like, it just doesn't make sense. You make life so much harder for them, and that will hold back massive success. There's and understand what your Chinese competitors are doing, right? Like, I think there is I'm not sure if it was Hisense or Xiaomi, one of the, well, obviously local TV manufacturers, who did something so simple, but I think they were one of the first ones, and I've never seen it internationally before. Is a TV market is obviously super competitive, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and that's the new models, new innovations, and all that stuff, and they have very short sort of lifetime. Well, once they're sold, I think people replace their TVs every 5 years,
2-3 years.
Like the models that don't need to be renewed. There is often, that's a very sort of pricing battle, right? I'm not talking about the high-end OLEDs, the big screens. I'm talking about like the mom and pop TV. And I think it was Hisense or Xiaomi that says, you know what, let's make the purchase of the TV significantly cheaper, but create an advertising network around it. So the moment you put your TV on, you see two of these advertising pre-rolls, as they call them, and that co-funds the purchase price of your TV. So I can offer that TV for 30-40% less. All what needs to happen is that when they switch it on, and it's always connected to the internet anyway, they have to watch 2 ads before they see the real content. As a consumer of let's call it the mom and pop TV, I don't mind watching 2 15-second ads or 2 30-second ads if I can buy a TV for $200 less, right? It's a strategy that up to, I think, pretty recently, where Samsung launched their Samsung Ads business, none of the TV manufacturers thought about. Right now, you can go as a Western TV manufacturer. You can go into China and try to compete on pure pricing, but you know what I mean. Like, you're going to lose out to competitors that have a way more sort of localized and adaptable pricing strategy and offering in place. And that's just a small example where I'm like, why, like, if you from global say, hey, we need to align to the pricing strategies that we have anywhere in the world, in that sort of mid-range, mom and pop range, like, you're never going to win market share, right? So because of, you have to understand why people buy and how much pricing is obviously relevant. Again, that's just one example where I'm like, don't try to compete with them in areas where they just outsmart you. If that makes sense. Yeah,
absolutely. I own 2 TCLs and 2 Hisense and 1 TCL. I've always felt that the technology was way ahead. They were just priced a little bit lower because they weren't the brand names like Samsung and LG. And I knew that I was getting as good a TV for a cheaper price just because the brand name, and people around here just haven't caught up yet. So I will take.
Actually, it might have been TCL and not Hisense. I'm not sure who set up, but anyway, any of those set up the network model. I thought it was a smart strategy. Yeah,
it is. And if you have exposure to that market, you can see that, and then you could be maybe one of the first to take those learnings and take them back and take them to what you're doing in North America or into Europe. And you'd have winning strategies, and it will pay dividends. Even the expense and those pioneering costs for your company to go in, you're getting that back in what you're learning and how you're growing as a company and how innovative you are. I liked what you said about blindfolding your company or your staff or whoever's kind of in that expansion team going across. I almost think it's even more than blindfolded. People who are blindfolded know that they don't know what's out there, so they're actually reaching and grasping. But I think it's worse because what they're doing is they're not checking their ego at the door, and they're trying to take what they've already done and just inject it and lay it into the new region that they're going. So, I mean, at least people that are blindfolded know that they can't see. these people don't know that they can't see. They just think they're just seeing something else. Therefore, they can't see what they should see.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've held APAC-wide leadership positions at some of the world's largest marketing companies. You have a perspective that's broader than just China. So I want to lean in a little bit more on other areas in APAC. So looking beyond China, what are the APAC consumer markets that excite you the most?
Well, it has to be India. In all honesty, for a few reasons. I think the obviously scale of opportunity there as well. I think interestingly enough, and I said it earlier in the podcast, that I always felt that India was always developing and innovating for outside of India. I see a lot more innovation happening in India for India, so domestically. I think also empowered by the significant investments that the likes of Google, Facebook, and Amazon did in market. And I think the likes of Mukesh Ambani, etc., a couple of the very wealthy investors and people in market, looking at some Chinese successes and trying to replicate that into India. I think he just announced that he wants to launch a sort of a WeChat style super app and bring that into market. I've seen a lot of disruptiveness in India that excites me. I've seen the way that they challenge the telecom industry and made data very affordable, and it's the sort of switch from feature phones into smartphones. Because of that, has driven sort of digital adoption a lot. So I've seen a lot of interesting things in India happening. I think the big challenge in India I still see is, and I sort of call it sort of quality brand positioning. I think a lot of the local Indian brands, they're just very, very, I'd say bad in positioning the brand from a quality perspective. It's about there's some comparison to China in that, to be honest, because in China a couple of years ago, all of a sudden that switch was made as well, where brands were able to position themselves in a more sort of premium way by just the they put a lot more effort into the brand value and the positioning of it. And one of the first brands I think in China that did it for consumer brand was DJI from the drones and stuff. I think that was, for me, that was one of the first sort of Chinese consumer products that I looked at. I was like, hey, this looks like high quality, well positioned, well written document. You know what I mean? Like you open up a packaging, you pay whatever, a couple of $100 for it. You open it up, and you're like, okay, this looks good. Right. So I as a Western consumer looked at it as like, okay, this is a quality product. If it flies well or not, that's a different story. I think it was pretty decent, but that's what I still miss in India, in all honesty. That sort of the quality positioning, because I don't know a lot of Indian brands. Let it be for domestically or internationally. I was like, okay, this feels like quality. But I'm not the audience in India, obviously. But I think that's sort of the next step they need to get into. So I think that's India on one side. Then a lot of people, this is going to be the year of Indonesia. There's always the talks about that, just because of the scale, 250, 300 million people, etc. I love India. I'm a little bit less bullish about it because I think there's a lot of complexity there. Well, for me, actually, the next country in that list would be Vietnam. Young population, but I'm not. And the main thing there is it reminds me a little bit of China back in the days and Singapore back in the days, what we were talking about. Like if you walk to Ho Chi Minh or Hanoi, you feel that energy, that vibe is going on there. There's stuff bubbling up, if you know what I mean. And so that excites me about Vietnam. And I think there's a lot of. It's a good bridge between Southeast Asia and China as well. I think it's sort of accepted on both sides, and I think there's a lot of innovation potential coming from that. Very domestically focused. Obviously, a lot of local brands, but still a lot of Western brands trying to get a foothold there. I don't know. It's just good energy, and I think that gives might not have the ultimate skill as some of the other markets, but I think there will be a lot good innovation coming out of that market in the near future, and a growing population, young population, very exciting stuff.
Two of my favorite vacations that I've ever had, one to Bali and one to Nha Trang for kite surfing in Vietnam. Both were just absolutely brilliant vacations. I loved it. And you're right. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm going to intentionally try to set you off with a very naive question. Can brands simply employ a regional strategy when it comes to APAC?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Because it depends on the alternative. If the regional strategy is there to replace the global strategy, then yes. Right? Because going in with a global strategy, that sets you up for failure even more.
Yeah, true.
If the regional strategy replaces local strategy, then obviously no. And then I think at sort of the middle way to that is probably have more sort of a 4 or 5 sort of sub-regional approaches. You sort of take Southeast Asia around sort of the India-Pakistan corner. You take Southeast Asia itself. You take sort of ANZ. You take Greater China, although there are very differences between Taiwan and China. But you take Greater China, and you sort of bundle. And I know they don't like it. You bundle sort of Japan and Korea a little bit. And then you can set up a little bit more sort of sub-regional strategies. Again, it's not perfect as well, but I think it's really what's the starting point is I think the main thing there. I think you have to watch out. Well, I don't think anybody should go into APAC, if you know what I mean. They shouldn't look at it that way. You go into a specific country. Every country is different in that. And you have country strategies, and once countries are established, it doesn't mean you can't put them over sort of a regional leadership if that's relevant. But my strategy will always be to keep regional, let it be leaderships or operations, whatever it is, as light as possible, and build as much as possible in market itself. But again, it all depends. If global strategy is the alternative, then please let's go ahead with regional.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are some solutions as far as maybe logistics and some distribution center hubs that you can maybe look at. Maybe there's some finance options that you can that cover some of the regions platforms.
Absolutely, I think how I normally look at it is like commoditized services. I think there's two things there. There's commoditized services. You have to ask yourself if you want to get into commoditized services because they're very price focused. There's lower margin. That's from an offering point of view. But if you have those, then I absolutely would try to centralize that at a lower cost location. Especially if if they're commoditized, and often it's relatively straightforward work. If it comes to more sort of back office type activities, that'll be finance, etc. Yes, you try to sort of centralize that as much as possible as well. But everything that's client facing and needs to be hyper local, you need to build it up there. So it also depends a lot on what type of product we're talking about or services, obviously. Mm-hmm. So there's not a one size fits all. But the interesting thing is that all the models have been tried and tested, and some of them work for one and don't work for the other. And often it's also pretty cyclical, right? Depends a little bit on leadership often as well, where they have more of a local versus regional approach. And again, there's no right and wrong. It just depends on what works for what type of company at what time. Right. But when it comes to really trying to enter some of the key markets, like you're never going to be successful in China trying to do it out of Singapore, right? Like it doesn't work that way. Like back in the day, sounds like all, but like 10, 15 years ago, it's like, okay, I'm going to set up a regional HQ. I'm going to do it or in Singapore or in Hong Kong. I do Singapore if I also want to enter Southeast Asia and be close to Australia. I do Hong Kong if I want to enter China, because at that time, setting up in China mainland wasn't as easy. So you take Hong Kong as your sort of regional HQ and then try to sort of build it out from there. I think that time has passed. Like you need your boots on the ground. It's already difficult enough to do business in Beijing from Shanghai, for example, let alone from Hong Kong, if you know what I mean. Like so, or Shenzhen or Nanjing, whatever it is. So you have to go local if you're serious about it. But you don't have to do it all at the same time, right? And again, that's why there's you're not going to roll a market out or region out in a year. So there needs to be at least a 5-year strategy against it.
Yeah, it would take a pretty big bank account to be able to do multiple, 3 or 4 markets at the same time, just because of, the amount of spend that you are going to have to put into having local and boots on the ground, as you said.
Yeah, okay, I think that's one. But I think it also the besides the fact that if you have a big bank account and you say, let's say you can fund it. Let's not underestimate the time and attention it needs to have from existing leadership to support it, right? Who often already have, the day-to-day job, if you know what I mean. Like if you can be a global CFO, CEO, or ops, whatever it is, and all of a sudden you're launching 5 markets at the same time in Asia. That's going to take a lot of your time as well, no matter how many people you employ for it. You need to keep your head into it as well, because it's such a different environment. And it might be partly off the global strategy. You need to be across that. So it's both money and time at all senior levels.
Okay. All right, Michel, last question. What are some of the most significant trends within the broader ad industry that we should be paying attention to, or that are simply just your favorites?
Ad industry or sort of our daily lives, I think the only right answer probably is AI there, right? I have to admit, and it's exciting. I don't think it's scary, but I think it's mainly exciting. We have no idea what's coming at us at any industry and in any of our lives. But when it comes to the ad industry, it's going to impact us from the impact on copywriting, personalization at greater scale, more automation around sort of the media buying side, efficiency, effectiveness on client and agency sides. It's impacting us in so many different ways. And then the negative side of it, and I think maybe not as exciting, but still very exciting, but in a different way, is obviously the impact of sort of misinformation that comes out of it. And how we deal with that, because when you're in the not only the ad industry, but sort of in marketing and sort of media in general, we are able to steer minds in the direction that we want minds to go. That's a function of our industry, right? If we like it or not. Like we're trying to convince that soap A is better than soap B. When you walk into that store, that you pick soap A and not soap B. That's a function of sort of the ad industry. When we say that something is better, or like AI can have scary impact on that in many ways, and I think that sort of misinformation is an industry responsibility to react on and work on and find solutions. So that's sort of the dark side potentially of it. And then I think one trend that unfortunately I've seen pushed back a little bit is the whole discussion around sustainability, which would be good if we could sort of bring that back a little bit more to the front. And I think it's partly, in times of financial uncertainties, you see that we see it also in like the sustainability funds, etc. Is that great that still exists, but eventually, people put money somewhere to get an ROI out of it. So all of a sudden it becomes a lot more sort of the money focused again than the purpose focused. So hopefully, when, maybe not this year, but early next year, when interest rates are going down and hopefully some PE money flows back, then the sustainability topics and criteria come back to higher on the priority list, because I think that's important to do. Just in, not just in the ad industry, but just in general. I think, a little bit of a sidestep, but I mean, you're living in an environment where you have forest fires everywhere around. We had a crazy hot summer in Europe. There's a lot of bad stuff happening with the world, which I think we all need and can pay a little bit more attention to. It's a bit of a sidestep, but it's an important one.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Michele, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you being on the podcast with us.
You're welcome, Todd. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. For everybody watching us on YouTube, don't forget we have the audio version of the podcast everywhere you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you name it. And for those of you listening to us audio only, don't forget that we are on the YouTube channel over at wpic.co. So for me, for everybody at The Negotiation, and for Michele, thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.